Hey, good evening and welcome, everyone. My name's Kate Melchior. I'm the Associate Director of Educator Engagement and Outreach at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I am delighted to have you join us this evening for a talk that's highlighting how Latina women and community institutions in early 20th century Boston shaped inter-American relations through bilingual education, art exhibitions, festivals, and community programming. At the MHS, we host a variety of events that delve into the complexities of history and encourage people to share their observations, interpretations, and ideas. This program began with the ideas and research of Dr. Miriam Villanueva when she was a Kass Teacher Fellow with my department in 2024. I was so lucky to get to work with her then, and I'm honored to introduce her today. Dr. Villanueva is an educator at Phillips Academy and a historian of modern Latin American history. Dr. Villanueva will be in conversation with Dr. Celina Miranda, Executive Director of Hyde Square Task Force, a youth development organization located in the Jamaica Plain neighborhood of Boston, and Cristela Guerral, an arts and culture reporter formerly at WBUR, who facilitates and leads conversations around race, identity, and equity. I now invite you to join me in welcoming tonight's speakers and to enjoy this evening's talk.
Bienvenidos. It's a joy to be here with you all today to share what I uncovered at the Massachusetts Historical Society's archives. It's a history that it's both deeply rooted in Boston's past and resonant with its present as the city considers how to support its Latina residents. When thinking of Boston's Latina history, though, oftentimes individuals tend to think about the 1960s, 1970s migration that occurred. But today I want to take us back further. I want to share a story that reimagines who was shaping Latina Boston and when. So I want to begin with the 1930s. Let's set the scene. So in the country, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was understanding that Europe was fractioning and coming into conflict right as the world was struggling with the Great Depression. So to turn inward, he started thinking more about how to develop a relationship with Latin America once again. And so for his administration, they ended up enacting the Good Neighbor policy, hoping that it would, one, subdue Nazi influence, and then two, reassert the US as the primary trade partner in the region. Now, see, the difficulty with this was that the United States had already developed a reputation in Latin America as being quite forceful in its expansion, one, enforcing business, and then two, with its military interventions. And so for him, policy-wise, he had declared that there would be no more armed intervention, but he still needed to address public perception here in the United States and also in Latin America, where this public perception was a bit soured. And so with that, they decided to create the Office of the Coordinator for Inter-American Affairs. And it is within that office that they decided to bring back this vision known as Pan-Americanism. Now, Pan-Americanism was originally conceived by the liberator Simón Bolívar, and it was this idea that they were going to foster unity across all of the countries of the Americas. But when the United States picked it up, while they believed in that mission, it was also still to favor the US's economic dependence. But in this case, with this Pan-Americanism, they really were, in some ways, trying to stress this unity between them, this guise of friendship, so to speak, right? While still adhering to some US-centric favoritism, but they were trying to be more intentional about developing these good relations. And this is what's interesting about this Pan-Americanism that separates it from previous ones, is that according to Lisa Ubelacher, what made this version stand out was that it actually became participatory. It was a project that spread root in local communities, with people on the ground holding parades, listening to radio programs, watching movies, and supporting Latin American students studying in the United States when they couldn't go study in Europe anymore due to the conflicts. And so, in effect, this Pan-Americanism was actively constructing a regionalist idea across the nation. So it's within this context that we see the Pan American Society of Boston be formed in 1940. And on paper, its mission was simple. It was to foster goodwill and cultural exchange, but in practice, it became a site where elite women curated particular versions of Latin America designed to serve diplomatic interests. And as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, it's very clear that they were also quite involved in developing their own idea of a good neighbor policy, right? And immediately you would think that this is a Yankee Civics Club from the outside, but in looking in, it actually tells a much deeper story. Because this is what's really interesting about the Pan American Society of Boston, is that in the society's first few decades, its members weren't just politicians or businessmen, they were women, astoundingly women. And they were quite educated, they were skilled in their own right in Latin America, either having lived there for a long time, having been there, or skilled in teaching about Latin America. And these women, when they took up this charge to create the Pan American Society, they decided to lead these cultural committees. As you could see with the picture frame in the middle, they worked with principals all around the Boston and greater Boston area to promote Pan American Days, bilingual education programs at schools, and they also were planning agendas for visiting dignitaries and leaders from Latin America. As you can see on the right-hand side, these women were the unofficial US diplomats, and they embodied this soft power politics by using culture and hosting to their advantage to insert themselves in conversations about US-Latin American relations. But let's take a pause here, because I want to ask, while these women were in charge, what version of Latin America was being presented? And in its early years, we see that the society had these reoccurring themes, such as on the left-hand side, what you see is Latin America as festive, colorful, and adventurous. Many of their events that were especially dictated by the government flattened complex political and social realities into cultural performance, prompting folklore without context and rhythm without revolution. As you can see, that kind of programming on the left-hand side felt a little more costumey. But on the other hand, when you look at the right-hand side, what you see is actually more localized and imagined programming that went beyond what the government was dictating. And it's with this programming that what you find is a very rich, authentic programming that benefited from Latina members who had been here in Boston for quite some time. Because what makes the Boston Pan American Society so unique is that also most of their early membership were actually Latinas who had been living in the region for quite a while, separating themselves from other organizations. And it's these Latin Americans who had participated in the Pan American Society. They had as well their own thriving organizations that helped them figure out how they wanted to participate within this society. So I want to share about one of those organizations, because it's the Club Español de Boston that was founded in 1901 that really shows that these Latin Americans, for decades prior to the Pan American Society, had been also hosting their own lectures, dances, language groups, and theatrical productions, and all in their languages, in Spanish and in Portuguese. So they already knew how to host and how to present Latin America to their communities. But even more so, this club was a place where Latine represented themselves. And in some ways, it functioned more as a cultural embassy by being selective, elite, and internally driven, and even resorting to enforcing language rules. So if you weren't speaking the right language, you're out. You had to be able to participate fully. And we have to recognize as well, though, that they were quite privileged, right? This was a club that was run by a lot of paraprofessionals and leaders within their own communities, We have some images here that really highlight some of the leaders, one of them being a leading nurse in the Lynn Hospital, Miss Robert M. Crisol, who is demonstrating her El Salvadorian traditional wear. And then at the bottom, on the left-hand side, you can also see one of the local Panamanian leaders of the club, Beatriz Mendez, also showing her pollera and her pride in her culture for the community of the Club Español de Boston. And so they were risk takers. They created this club at a time where xenophobia was rampant, but they rejected this oppressive assimilation, right? And they were able to use that elite status to really push back and assert themselves. And so by the time the Pan American Society was created in 1940, it was actually the Club Español de Boston members who benefited most from its creation, because it offered them new possibilities to exert their influence and their authority. So what emerges is this inclusion in the club into the society and help differentiate it actually from regressive Pan-American societies that had existed across the country that had been thinking about Latin America in the abstract. While here in Boston, they weren't just thinking about it more critically, but they had an actual mass of Latin Americans within their society dictating and shaping programming. And so over the decades from the 1940s up until the 1960s, what you see are galas and festivities and art exhibits, all very thoughtfully made, but definitely to highlight the beauty of Latin American history. And this Club Español de Boston was absolutely a part of that. However, over the decades, the society, it found itself at a crossroad. So by the early 1960s and 1970s, what we see is this new migration of Latin American families coming into Boston, given that they were fleeing political violence and economic crises in Latin America. And it reduced the desire for these playful galas and entertaining moments. And for the society, there was a moment where they realized they had to think more inwardly. So what we find is they start, instead of posting a lot of galas, they start promoting a lot of piñata parties for local Puerto Rican children. They start working with artists like Alan Crite to be able to design artwork that's going to be more educative to these new incomers. But by this moment, Pan American society had its whole vision deferred, because what was happening internationally really showed that Pan-Americanism as a vision was failing to uphold its promise. What we see is in these 1960s, 1970s era, the United States leaning more into supporting authoritarian regimes in Latin America. They are pushing their security doctrine, and as a result, there's this rising anti-Yankee sentiment happening. So even when the Pan American Society was starting to change and evolve to be more responsive, they couldn't reconcile with the fact that this Pan American vision wasn't actually happening under the United States government, right? And even more so than that, local newspapers that had once been promoting their ideas, promoting their events, were disinterested, to the point where they started mocking and laughing at a lot of the different initiatives that the society had. So with that said, what do we inherit from this history? Now that we understand this, we can find that feminized labor over time was undervalued and erased. Many of these women are unknown, and yet they meet such strides in creating a Latin American vision here in the region. In addition to that, what we inherit is not just facts, but questions for the present. Most importantly, how does Boston's historical narrative change? Now knowing the longue durée of Latin American local history goes beyond the mid-1900s and actually can be in the late 1800s. So today, as we celebrate Latina Heritage Month, I hope that the work of these societies and now more inclusive and thoughtful nonprofits that exist can help us flesh out how we think of Latinx Boston at a time when we're trying to strive for more unity rather than hate. Thank you. And now we're going to start a conversation that I think will be very informative.
Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry I was late. I'm so happy I was able to see the majority of that presentation. It was remarkable. My name is Cristela Guerral. I'm up until July 18th, I was a senior arts and culture reporter at WBUR. I have officially relocated to the border. I'm moving to El Paso. So actually, I'm here to do this event because I was honored to be able to say yes to this, and also to pick up my cats, if I'm honest, before my partner and I fly down to El Paso, where I work now with Report for America, mentoring and coaching young journalists, about 35 young journalists between Denver, Colorado, and Birmingham, Alabama. So I oversee about 35 folks. RFA is a program that people apply to. Newsrooms ask for beats, maybe an environmental reporter in the Mississippi Delta, and then reporters ask to cover beats, and we pair them. So after 20 years in the field, I'm in a different role, but I actually have told everybody in Boston I love conversations like this, and gosh, ask me to do them all the time, especially, frankly, during Hispanic Heritage Month. I was really intrigued by so many things, but I'm also very upset at you that you did not tell me that you studied my country so much.
I did, yes.
We had this whole conversation. My Neiman was about the relationship between the US and Panama. I was born in Panama, but I find it fascinating not only that there was a pollera, which is our national dress, but to understand the ways that, I think to your point, we would assume that, especially at a time where immigration laws were so expected, and that folks were being told, don't speak Spanish. Abuelas, grandmothers, I have friends whose grandmothers specifically said, I'm not speaking to you in Spanish, I want you to fit in. And they never learned the language. So we're talking about an era where it was deeply focused on what it was to be fully American, according to a very nationalistic perspective. I'm wondering, could you talk about the origin of this research? Like, when did you sort of delve into this in between covering anti-imperialism in Panama?
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. So I had studied Panama for quite some time for my doctoral dissertation, but even moving forward. But last year, I became aware of the Kass Fellowship that the Massachusetts Historical Society offered. And I thought, wow, that is a great opportunity to kind of get to flex my muscles a bit. I've been teaching at a boarding school for quite some time, and I hadn't really had much time to do research. And so when I saw the fellowship, it intrigued me. I have a very deep passion for studying Latin America, and when I saw the Historical Society's posting about the fellowship, I thought, let me look and peruse through their archive and see if there's anything related to Latin America. And sure enough, I found this archive on the Pan American Society papers that no one had looked at yet. It had been a collection that I just found out today that they received 25 years ago, but had just been finally completed its processing. So it was a real joy to receive the fellowship and be really the first visiting researcher to dig through it and find this history, which I wasn't, to be honest, I wasn't anticipating finding so many Latina residents in the Boston and Greater Boston area at that time. So when I found the information about the Club Español de Boston, I was overjoyed. Because that just goes to show that they weren't just here in 1901 when they created it. They were here before that, right?
Do we have a sense, and this is just a follow-up, I'm wondering about, journalistically I covered arts and culture and race and identity, and we didn't cover, I don't think we need to cover immigration, I believe we need to cover migration and migrants to understand the ways that this country has sort of moved. And when I get the Hyde Square Task Force, we're going to talk about the various groups that have come through our communities. What did you notice who was sort of coming in at different points? Because that was also in the middle of the building of the canal. It was when Panama, not to focus on my country, but there was a big influence of like Gilded Age billionaires putting money into Central America trying to sort of make a buck, and immigrants coming to this country, I think, trying to start their life. What was the intersection of like folks migrating at the time?
So this is where it gets really interesting. I kind of mentioned it in my talk that these weren't just everyday Latina folks. Like they were elite. They were well known. So there were some of them who came from really established families in Latin America who come to Boston to study, to primarily study first. We have some premier universities here, and so they made their way and they decided to continue staying here. And then on the other side, with a lot of the women who found themselves here, they also were from well-to-do families, but also I noticed a trend where a lot of them came from countries where the U.S. had militarily intervened. And that's where Panama comes in, where when we find a lot of these women are here, it's because they either married servicemen or married diplomats or married businessmen who had been involved in, say, the Panama Canal or had been working in the canal zone and had made their way up here. And so we're noticing that in places like El Salvador with the banana plantations. We're noticing that with Cuba, with the Dominican Republic, with Puerto Rico. And so that's where we were seeing them mostly. But I think that's the real differentiation, right, is that early immigration and migration of Latina people came with some privileges that allowed them to really skirt away from xenophobia, right? Because in the early 1900s, this is also a time where in the Texas border, you have widespread lynching of Mexican Americans, right? And a real fear and silencing of folks. But yet here in Boston, they were thriving with their club. They were hosting theatrical plays at the Harvard Club, right? They were not ashamed of being who they were. They did have that privilege, unlike what you see later with migrants that come in that don't have that elite status here in Boston.
Yeah. Celina, I wonder, I need to figure out how to fix this. Would you talk to me about like the echoes that you notice specifically in the work you do now? Because it does feel like we're connecting, there's a big arc from that migration to the present. I lived in Lynn for the past 7 years. Lynn has a varied history of Latine, and frankly, Latine queer folks, if I'm honest. There's a big history there. Where you're based has had endless different groups intersecting all at once. Would you talk a bit about the mission of your organization, but also what you've seen historically in it?
Sure. So again, Celina Miranda, and I'm the Executive Director of Hyde Square Task Force. We're a creative youth development organization located in Jamaica Plain, specifically in the Hyde-Jackson Square area of Jamaica Plain, otherwise known as Boston's Latin Quarter. And, you know, it's interesting as I was listening to your talk and realizing that for those of us who are leading organizations that are focused on serving mostly the Latina community, the story usually begins exactly where you said, which is in the 60s, sort of really thinking about the different groups that came in the 60s and then thereafter. In Jamaica Plain, in particular, you had a wave of Puerto Ricans that first came to the area, and they were very active. And from there, you had sort of the group started to change. So it was Puerto Rican, Cuban, yeah. So a lot of Cubans as well. And then now, and a sprinkling of Salvadorans in the 70s and 80s, which doesn't surprise you given everything that was going in El Salvador during that time. So a lot of folks fleeing the war. I'm Salvadoran myself, so I'm very familiar with that story. And then now it's mostly Dominican youth. And our focus as an organization has also shifted over time. We started as an organization that was mostly there to provide a safe space for young people, but really also to organize the community against what felt like neglect for many, many years. In fact, that particular area of Jamaica Plain was known as the cocaine capital of New England, given all the violence, all the drug dealing, et cetera, that was happening in the 80s, which is around the time that we started to come together as Hyde Square Task Force. But over time, now we mostly work with young people from the Dominican Republic, and our focus as an organization has shifted, where we're utilizing the arts, dance, music, and theater as a way of engaging young people, all rooted in Afro-Latin culture.
Is it just a follow-up? What have you noticed when you're teaching maybe a history they're not learning at school, especially maybe for first generation? You know, maybe at home, maybe they speak Spanish, maybe they don't. What does it mean to them to be able to go there and just be fully themselves?
It's very powerful, and definitely, you had sort of, and as an organization, it was interesting to see the parallels between what you were saying and sharing as organizations in terms of initially starting with just having it be more festive, but definitely now being more rooted in context and making sure that our young people understand historically their journey into this country, their family's journey, and what that has meant, and then for them to get connected to a part of them that unfortunately, even to this day, I think oftentimes you have the pressure to separate yourself from that history. And so here we are as an organization rooting our young people in who they are and making sure that they're connected and that there's a sense of pride and a deep understanding of where they come from. And seeing our young people really speak to it and gravitate and tell us how proud they feel about sort of the music that they hear in their homes, the stories that they hear also, because there's a lot of the oral tradition and they've been hearing these stories over and over, whether it's from abuela, whether it's from tío, but they're hearing them and now we're contextualizing them and also giving them a broader perspective. It's not just in your unit, right, in the family unit, but it's bigger than that, and for them to understand that. Just in recent years, we've been taking cultural trips to Puerto Rico for them to really understand what we're talking about. And it's been fascinating to see it and what it's coming in terms of their sense of belonging, their sense of feeling that they can go far. And they can begin to, I think, walk into spaces that are predominantly non-Latino and feel comfortable and ready to be able to be at the table.
Absolutely. Something I noticed, and I wonder if it's my phone. It's absolutely my phone. Something I noticed from the actual presentation that caught my eye that I thought I would ask, and folks, I'd love to bring you in if you have questions. I'm sure you do, because God knows I have a ton. But it was the question, it said in the presentation, it said, what do we really know about our neighbors to the south? So we're talking about like immigrants that are attempting to find a place for themselves as a minority, at least at the moment. And I've never liked the word minority. I also don't like third world. I don't like any of this language. I find it all to be fairly reductive. But what was the perception of these folks? Over time, it seemed like on the one hand, they were given this place of power. They were given a place. They were also sort of entertainment. And we could get into this if you want to, but I went to the Bad Bunny residency, and there's an entire conversation being had. That's not a humble brag, but what have you. There's a conversation being had about Puerto Rico as the place that Bad Bunny said, if you want to see my concert, which is the hottest concert of the year, you're coming to Puerto Rico. And I'm not performing in the mainland United States. From Puerto Rico, I'm going to Europe, and I believe anywhere else. And he said, not only do I not want ICE outside of my concerts, but I want you to see what Puerto Rico is. But there's a discussion being had in Puerto Rico saying the merchandising itself, the hats, the flowers people get to the airport, and there was a term for it, which I think some people find fairly vulgar. Puerto Rico was like Fiesta Island. Bad Bunny has a song where he says, I don't want to see what happens to you, what happened to Hawaii. So there's an entire conversation around colonization, both as an island, as a place in the Caribbean where people with privilege, power, and wealth view as like, this is where I vacation no matter how it impacts your life. And people are kind of feeling like that's, despite his best intentions to bring millions of dollars, it also brings a whole like, it's a big conversation around how much people actually understand about Puerto Rico, or are they really just in general?
As we encourage progress and create jobs, we also diminish the cultural heritage of that area, and people only go to the resorts, and they don't see the rest of Mexico. They don't see the rest of Puerto Rico. They don't go to the wonderful jungle that exists there that I know was damaged in the hurricane and then now has recovered.
Totally.
Right? So how do we show both or all sides, I think, is a question, because people don't know our history.
That's my question. That's a wonderful question. Yeah.
I'm jealous he went to the Bad Bunny concert. Like, we're gonna need a slideshow of the pictures you took.
So many pictures and videos, I really do. And
Oh.
actually,
Exactly, now we know.
and the last concert is Saturday, and it's on the anniversary of Maria. So there's a whole, again, from an arts and culture perspective, how is art used to also bring and shed light on like the political ramifications of like environmental justice, you know? The police.
was so devastating.
Totally, yeah.
Well, you bring up a really good question, and I think I can answer it in two ways. With the Club Español de Boston, they were already economically safe. They had elite status, and so for them, their club was more about enjoying themselves, not so much promoting Latin America externally to Boston and Greater Boston, but more so like creating a space where they could have fun, right? And so that's why for a lot of their programming, it was really festive. Now with the Pan American Society of Boston, they were struggling, right? They were struggling with the fact that they existed because the federal government's Office of the Coordinator for Inter-American Affairs wanted to establish these societies all across the country with the intention that it would promote this different idea of Latin America to United States citizens, right, who had seen Latin America before as being foreign. They often denigrated it. They often viewed it as just spaces that were deserving of military intervention, right? And so the intention of the government was, create these societies, kind of foster this goodwill. But in doing that, a lot of that government programming, like that Pan American Exposition you saw, felt very superficial. It was very costumey, and to the point that you brought about Bad Bunny and some of it relying on the tropes of a region, it definitely, in a lot of ways, relied on those tropes. Something that I didn't share was, in the archives, during the war era of World War II, the society used to hold pageants, Pan American pageants. Like they would decide on beauty queens who were the Pan American Beauty Queen of Boston, right? And it didn't have a good sound to it. The pictures are pretty, but yeah, definitely the idea behind it was really rough, right? But what I like to think is at that time, that was the few ways that women knew how to exercise their power here, was through like hosting and through pageantry and through dinner clubs. And so that they were kind of limited to what they knew, but then at the same time, this is where the story gets a little complicated, because those government-enforced projects were pretty rough, but when they started to create their own kind of internal programming, that was pretty rich. Like they would invite women scientists. Like one of the images I didn't get to talk about, she was a woman scientist from Uruguay. And they invited her to give a talk about the biology that she was working on. They were hosting a lot of really professional women to share their expertise, not even so much on Latin America, but just about what they were studying, and they happened to be Latin American, right? So there are these really beautiful moments where you see some really good intentionality when they were able to do it. Because again, like they were confined to the fact that the society existed because the government wanted it to exist. Yeah.
Questions? In the back? Yeah. And then over here.
Good evening. What part of Boston were they, the club, the Spanish club were in? And to answer her question, the one in the front where you can learn more about Hispanic lessons, PBS does a wonderful job. Penny Hinich, who is a cook, a chef, not only will talk about Mexico and how beautiful the rich history, she does a subset of that. And John Leguizamo, everything. You want Spain, Mexico, Nicaragua, El Salvador. It's wonderful. You know, he is so proud, and I'm proud, you know, even though I'm not Hispanic myself. There's nothing like learning and seeing and understanding what was here first. And you guys were definitely here first. And, it's beautiful. You know, people don't realize when you hear, you know, Texano or even Los Angeles, hello, San Diego, hello. Santa Fe, what do you think that begins with? What is that? I learned even in Central America, which is us, Wyoming, Mexican. They had the land first. It's just something to look at. And PBS will do everybody, but when it's Latin month, that is something, like I said, detailed. And it's like, your mouth will drop. Your mouth will drop. And you'll be so proud.
It's media, it's communications, it's comedy, it's art. Like usually the way culture is taught is sort of through honey. Like people try and give it to people in a way that I think makes it palatable for folks. And we're living in a time where historically we're watching things be erased that the powers that be find uncomfortable, which was honestly sometimes the only way you could teach the true suffering and violence and challenge of the way this nation was born is through image. When I did my Neiman Fellowship, I took a class, Migration, Refugees, and Human Rights, and most other students were refugees. And we spoke about our experiences as a war was raging overseas, and it's a sort of like, there's both the way the media is being censored, just as a journalist, and then also like the way that art is then being dictated to, and history is being rewritten. I think we also had a question over here. Please, yeah.
Because I'm an educator. I'm currently in my class, I teach a U.S. history class, and we're talking about enslavement. A lot of the websites that I would use for primary sources, for digging in a little more closely, they're disappearing. Like the National Park Service websites that we were relying on, some of them are just gone, right? And so that's why with the Hyde Square Task Force, when you said that your organization, your nonprofit was really making it a point to teach the children about their history, about the history of the area, it brought me so much joy because I was like, we're at a time where we don't know what to trust anymore online. And with what we did trust, it's disappearing, right? So we have to really empower ourselves to do it, and you've been doing it.
And in fact, actually, we lost a grant from the federal government exactly because of our focus, and we were told it was exactly for that reason. And the money just went, and we're like, well, we're not changing our mission. We're not changing our programming, because our programming is more important now than it ever has been. It's critical for us to keep doing the work that we're doing. And thinking about Bad Bunny, I was thinking about our work and realizing that when I never followed his music necessarily, but then I saw this latest album and I was like, that's what Hyde Square Task Force has been trying to do. It's true. That's what we're doing, right? Is making sure that sort of that art form that has been sort of seen as less than is put at the center, and recognizing the African roots. And so I'm like, Bad Bunny, you're copying us. You should quote me on that one.
I didn't get to answer the question about where were these Latine from. We don't have, at least I'm still trying to find it, we don't have addresses for those who were part of it in 1901, but I do have a membership list from the 1930s with the addresses, right? I'm not going to out them in case their families still live there. But what I will say is that they were from all over: Roxbury, Dorchester, Jamaica Plain, Cambridge, Somerville. We had people in Needham, Lynn, Lawrence. They ran the gambit of being from Boston and the greater Boston area, which I didn't quite mention, but also was pretty participatory in all this. Sorry, wanted to throw that in.
Thank you. I think my question mostly relates to the early people, like the 1911, I think was a date I saw up there. When I think of Latin America, it's like everything south of the Rio Grande, but that's obviously culturally a huge diversity. I mean, right off the bat, Brazil is Portuguese and the other countries are Spanish. Years ago, a friend of mine was Puerto Rican, his wife was Colombian, and sometimes they had to ask each other what they meant because their backgrounds were different. So when you look at, were the folks who created this original group from, mostly from one contiguous area, or how did they, I mean, you know, you wouldn't think of like all of Europe and having the pan-Europe, right? You have French, Italian, German, et cetera. How did they deal with the diversities amongst the people, the various countries that the folks came from?
We use Latinate today, right, to be inclusive, to not be binary. But at that moment in time, with the Club Español de Boston, when it was first created, it was with Hispanic in mind. So it did include a contingent from Spain. Just gonna say that. It also included a few individuals from Brazil that ended up growing over time. But for the most part, it's like what I explained earlier, where at least for the women, a lot of the women, they were from areas that the U.S. had intervened at some point in time and had established themselves in their countries. So like El Salvador, Guatemala, Panama, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Colombia, Venezuela, like you start to see those countries appear in a lot of the images that they're posting, the bulletins that they're creating. But for the men, because men were a part of the society, a lot of the men were from elite families from across many different countries who just had happened to come to Boston to study and then make themselves home here, right? And so that's where you see more countries from South America, like Peru, for instance, and Chile. So you actually do get to see, that's a good question, because you do get to see the difference in like where the women are coming from and where the men are coming from. Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
Tineda Tapia, first generation Dominican American with a Mexican dad. So I'm very much like this plethora of different cultures. And I guess one of the things that I have to ask, especially working with young adults that are Dominican from Lawrence, because that's where my mother migrated, I struggle with the current tensions between our younger generations and the older ones. I think our younger generations have such an awareness of the anti-Blackness that exists in Latina. They have such an awareness of how these histories have clashed, where our parents needed to shut up to survive. And so a lot of the work I try to do is building empathy between the intergenerational writing. We use my program under Roberto, we use writing as the method, and we write in Spanglish. And I guess the question I have is, how do we reconcile that? Because even with Bad Bunny, he had this one Puerto Rican professor educate him on his own history, right? And that's what like radicalized him, I think, a little bit, because there was a point in time, like, I love reggaeton, but I'm the, El General era, right? That we can talk about, of course, right? And we, yeah. Yeah, Tego Calderon was very black centered and very pro-black, and that flips, so that he's also part of that era that's a bit problematic with the colorism that exists in our country. So I guess I'm asking a lot of questions, but I'm wondering from all your different areas, how do you navigate that intergenerational tension that currently exists in order to build more unity and authentic dreaming forward that we need in society today? Thank you.
Yeah, I think a lot about sort of teaching our young people the privilege that they have, right, to be able to sort of own their Blackness with pride and sort of be there, right, like, and to know that that hasn't always been the case. And let's talk about historically as to why that hasn't been. Why is it that it's okay for us to speak Spanglish, where I know that even for me, I came to this country in 1984. I'm Salvadoran, My parents were here, and if I spoke Spanglish in my house, my dad would go off, and I would hear the lecture. Choose which language you're going to speak, this or that. We don't do both. Choose. And here I prefer Spanish. I got the lecture. But Spanglish was a big no-no. And I think about now raising my daughter, and I'm like, girl, you just say it. I just want to hear a little Spanish, and I'm happy because you're proud and you're owning it. But I do want her to like be able to master both. But Spanglish is okay because it sort of reflects that experience of growing up ni de aquí ni de allá. You're not from here, you're not from there. You're just kind of, I always talk about home being wherever I'm at. Because as a kid who left at the age of 10, and then lived in California for 8 years, and then I've lived the rest of my life here, I still don't dare say that Boston's my home because people look at me like, but you're not from Boston. And you're like, all right, I'm not from Boston. But, it's sort of this interesting dilemma, and I think for them to understand the complexity of that experience and how what they have now hasn't always been the case. And I always say it comes from you got to look back. Who came before you and who has paved this way so that you have the opportunities and the ability that you have to walk in the world very differently than your grandparents and then your parents. And so I think that grounding them in that, and it's like this is a moment, this aha moment for them, like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I'm like, yeah, okay, respeto, right?
It's having me think of the layers of colorism. So one thing that we didn't talk about, right, in the talk is that these early Latina folks, right, who were arriving in the late 1800s up until the 1940s, a lot of them are light-skinned. You look at the photos, and even if they weren't elite, those were the women that intrigued most the servicemen, right? And so what we find is that they are either very light-skinned or they are white. Their families were European who happened to be living in Latin America, right? And so in a lot of ways, that definitely gave them a lot of privilege and helped them avoid that alienation, right? And there's a reason why we see in the 60s and 70s, like the Boston Globe and other newspapers start to be disinterested in the Pan American Society and promoting a lot of these Latino events, is because when we start to receive that migration in the 60s and 70s, what we see is a lot of Afro-Latinos, Afro-Caribbeans coming to Boston. They don't want to interact with them. They're not interested, right? They're not interested in promoting that. So that's where you also see that turn happen. And a lot of it does deal with that colorism.
People don't.
Can we just call it racism?
Yeah.
I mean, I think but there's like a really big distinction between the two, especially in a time where there was a hierarchy of shades. Like there was racism, but depending on if you were mulata, the conversation was had, especially among the French, they had a whole range of shades that were allowed to be associated with and weren't. And
in Dominican Spanish, we have different words for different types of brownness.
Yes.
Which makes no sense when you try to translate it in the U.S. mainland.
Yeah.
But over there, yo soy morena.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so there is an actual caste system.
Yeah.
Based off, the Spaniards in the 1500s. But yeah,
Totally.
it is an actual and it allowed you to be promoted for certain jobs.
Yeah.
Which allowed the
Colorism within the community.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, on top of the fact that the racism that had existed that existed and continues to exist in the Boston area, right?
Something that I think my journalism career was naturally going to bring me to was confronting the occupation of my country by the United States, which was the point of my Nieman Fellowship at Harvard. I also sort of always note this, but my dad passed my first semester. So in terms of primary resource, my father, the pediatrician, of 40 years, this great man, wasn't really there to provide the direction, and it was really hard to find my way back to the research. I remember them asking, why do you want to study Panama? Panama is from the 70s, we resolved that. And then a year later, suddenly my country is in this man's mouth a lot, especially specifically around the anniversary of the invasion of Panama in 1989. When I was 4, 2 days before the invasion, we had a frozen turkey in our suitcase and we flew in. So my family got stuck in Panama for a month, and the bombings were happening, and the country that we lived in was bombing the country that I was born in. And I didn't understand, but we knew that you can't really be occupied by something inside of you. Like, it's not an invasion, it's in you. I love sci-fi. I mean, it's alien, it's coming out of your chest. So when they invaded and used tactics that would later be used in the Gulf War, Panama was a testing site for weaponry, and it was used as a place to get Bush Sr. elected, because God forbid he has a drug dealer like Noriega in his back pocket. And he did through the 70s. We know all of this to be true. When the canal was returned, I was 15 and I was in Panama. So I'm a journalist in the country that colonized mine. I give this talk a lot. And when I was at Harvard, I realized, looking at Homeland Security documentation, looking at all the CIA, like looking at the paperwork that exists from that time, and then learning that not only was the canal built mostly by black folks from the West Indies, but those who died, the Americans that Trump is so concerned about, weren't Americans. They were black people that were brought in, promised a good life, and then Jim Crow segregation was in place in Panama. So anybody who was black was given whatever was available, and anybody of wealth or who was white was given all of what they needed to survive in a place that was called a sort of American utopia. Because as soon as you crossed into the canal zone, I don't know if folks know this, that was American territory. John McCain was born in the canal zone. He ran for president because he's an American citizen, because he was born in Panama when Panama was the US. So for 100 years, Panamanians tried to put their flag in the canal zone. And on one day that we still honor as the Day of Martyrs, a bunch of them were shot and killed by American soldiers. Students. And the presidents had to talk. And it started forcing the issue to the point that we eventually got a treaty in place that now Trump says was a stupid thing we should have never done. So I did not know when I did my Harvard Neiman that a year later, suddenly this would be relevant again. It'd be 78 all over again. But I did a podcast episode for Latino USA on it. And the main thing I was delving into was the colorism and the racism, because my country is black. And it has a long lineage of black history that I think people don't want to navigate, because there is so much other imperialism that you have to then deal with. It's too much. So.
And this is why the Pan-American vision
Yes.
fell apart. Because here's the thing too. In the late 70s and 80s, you start to see the men kind of take over and get more interested in the Pan-American society. But remember, this is the height of the security doctrine. And so when the Panama Canal treaties in the late 70s start to become a conversation, the Pan-American Society, the men are really insistent on forming these forums to talk about it, right? But these forums are definitely hell-bent on and seeing these treaties in a negative way, right? And the reason why is because a lot of the male membership was really pushing for that. In particular, the founding president, Ms. George Schaefer, her husband, in his own archive that I also looked at here at the Massachusetts Historical Society, he had folders on Panama that was incredibly negative. It would have made you so mad. He would be so mad. Because he also had folders on policing and why policing's good in Boston and abroad, and he was a very complicated and dangerous man. But you start to see that in those later years when the society's kind of really going downhill, and not to say it's all men's fault, but but in this case, that's kind of what you're starting to see, where they're kind of taking away some of the authority that the women had in forming these kind of more inclusive partnerships and really leaning into the security doctrine, right? Fully abandoning this idea of Pan-Americanism, of unity across the Americas, right? So they themselves kind of also put the last nail in the coffin, so to speak.
We have one more question here, and then I'll have you all give your final thoughts.
Hi, my name is Sabrina Silva, also a journalist, and I'm Brazilian born and moved here to the US when I was about 10 years old. And a lot of people are similar to me, where they move out of their country, they come into the US, they don't belong there because they're too American, and they don't belong here because they're not American enough. And it's interesting because looking at the history and seeing that in the early 1900s, you have this community of Latinos coming together and sharing their culture, their background. Today, I feel like, at least I can say this on my community, the Brazilian community, they don't spend the time together. They're not as unified. And I don't know if that's the same to say of other communities in Latin America. But here, what I've noticed, and it ties back to colorism, where early on you have these families that are coming in, they're white, they have money, and they have power. Today, that's no longer the case. And you do have a little bit of that, but a lot of it are immigrants that are coming here for a better life. And I've been noticing a lot of a divide within its own people. The Brazilian elite, who don't want anything to do with the Brazilians who are coming here for a better life. And I just wonder, how can we bring back that sense of community where your background, how much money you make, or why you came into the US, whether it was legally or not, to kind of just get to know each other, get to know the circumstances, and what would be your recommendation where we could bring that sense of community back again with people from all different backgrounds within one community? Oh. Okay.
So can I answer in kind of a, not tongue-in-cheek, but like actual, when I was a kid on the bus, there was a conversation around, one of the wars. And I think I was young, but I said something about the United States foreign policy, because that was me. And everybody on the bus told me to go back to my country. And some of those kids were not white American kids. So I made a PowerPoint and proposed to my high school that we should have an international club to learn about other cultures, and we could bring foods and have conversations and do all these things. And my vision when I was like 15 was that if we just fed each other, like information and food, we would actually solve everything. I was a teen, and I was told, well, we have a French club, a Spanish club, and a Latin club. We're fine. Like we're really covered. We have everything just with these three. And I honestly think it's a weird anecdote to say, I think sometimes they think it's too much. It's too much trouble to pronounce someone's name correctly. It's too much trouble to maybe learn a few words in someone's language. We're living in an era of such polarization that they'd rather just kind of go with the monolith because it's much easier than trying to understand the other side. And as a journalist, we're being pushed so hard to make sure that we are as unbiased as possible. But really, it's just about being radically accountable to your readers and like showing I am a queer Latina person born in Panama with immigrant parents, and like I'm a damn good reporter in the United States. And I would have been in my country if this country hadn't invaded mine, because maybe we would have stayed. So I think it's very nuanced, it's very complicated. I do believe a lot of it begins with conversations that people are too scared to have. That's me.
As you were sharing, I was thinking about the young volleyball player in Milford who ICE apprehended, Brazilian, right? The second one, Brazilian as well, in Milford, right? And for both of those instances, you see the community really rallying to fight for those kids, right? And so I think that there's these glimmers of hope that I see where we can rally, but it really depends on the creation of maintaining third spaces, right? With the Pan American Society, with the Club Español, the Boston, like there were these third spaces where people can convene and get to know one another and celebrate each other, and third spaces are disappearing, right? Like Hyde Square Task Force is fighting to maintain a third space, but they're difficult to find.
That's what it made me think of. It's like the social sector, right? Those of us who are in the nonprofit sector, whether it's Hyde Square Task Force, La Alianza Hispana, or EVA locally. That's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to make sure that we are bringing people together of all walks of life. However, we do function in sort of that nonprofit sector where we have to prove that we are needed, and that means that we need to sort of speak mostly to those who are most in need. And so right away, even in the way we have to present ourselves, we begin to divide ourselves, right? But I always sort of remind all of us that we know we need to own our privilege. I'm privileged in comparison to the young people that we work with, and I have to recognize that. But then it's like, how do we continue to create those third spaces for folks to come together? And I think about the work that Hyde Square Task Force is doing in managing the Latin Quarter. That whole work has been about placekeeping, not placemaking. And what that means is recognizing the history of that particular corner of Jamaica Plain. It's a very small corner. But when you think about what has made it so rich and so vibrant, has been all these different groups that have made this particular area of Jamaica Plain home. And it's been folks from El Salvador, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and most recently, because of gentrification, there's a whole other group of folks. But we say, you know what, everyone come, but come with respect for what's been here. And that's what we're going to do. So I think there is an opportunity for us to do so, but it also requires us to look within our groups and realize where we're still holding on to all these. We say we're all for everybody, but really, let's talk about, are we being exclusive? Are we saying, yes, you can come into the space, no, you can't come into the space because you don't belong for whatever reason, right? Whatever that may be. But those hard conversations, I think, still need to be had. So I'm glad you brought that up.
I think we've run out of time, but thank you. This has been wonderful.
Thank you to you, our audience online and in person, for these incredible questions and joining us for these just wonderful thoughts, and I hope this continues, all of us. I encourage you to visit our website to learn about our upcoming programs, including this weekend's workshop if you want to spend more time with Miriam. And we're grateful to all of the members in our audience who make programs like this possible. If you're not yet a member, I hope you will consider becoming one. Please head to the lobby to allow our staff to break down the space, and the building will close at 7:30. Thank you again, and have a wonderful evening.